The storm had been building all afternoon, crawling down from the mountains with a voice like torn canvas, and by nightfall it had swallowed the plains whole. Snow lashed the land with blind fury, covering earth, timber and track alike, and the world seemed nothing more than white breath and iron silence. It was in this silence that a cry tore loose, a sound not born of wind or beast, but of a child. A newborn's wail, thin and piercing, slicing through the storm like a knife across glass. The man who heard it was working by lantern light on the edge of the ridge, shirt bare against the cold. Most men would call such a thing madness, but labor had kept his blood running hot, and the snow that struck his shoulders melted before it clung. He was built tall and wide, a figure the land itself seemed to have carved. 30 years old, rough as pine bark, eyes the gray of iron cooled in water. His name was known in the settlement, though his voice seldom was, for he lived apart from town in his cabin among the timberline. Yet even a man carved from silence could not mistake the sound of a baby lost to the dark. He stilled, hand resting on the chain he had been hauling, breath curling before him in the blizzard. Then it came again, the thin, desperate cry of life too small for such a night. A woman's scream followed, raw, jagged, a sound of terror that chilled him more than the wind ever could. He dropped the chain and strode through the drifts, boots crushing ice, his steps steady and swift, driven by instinct older than thought. The railway track cut across the land like a silver vein, its rails iced and glinting faint beneath the storm. And there, sprawled against the frozen steel, lay the sight that stopped him cold. A young woman, no more than 20, her skin pale beneath a dress soaked through, bound by coarse rope to the rail itself. Her wrists were bloodied, her hair matted with snow, her mouth trembling in screams that the storm nearly swallowed. And beside her, wrapped poorly in thin cloth, was the child, an infant, red-faced and writhing, tied to the steel with cruel hands that had left no mercy behind. The rancher knelt, and for a moment the snow seemed to hush, as though even the storm paused to watch. He had seen violence before, duels in dusty streets, cattle torn by wolves, neighbors lost to hunger or fever, but this was something darker. To leave a mother and newborn to the iron and storm was not the act of men, but of shadows that wore men's faces. Her eyes flew to his, wide and wild, filled with terror, yet clinging to hope as if he were apparition or angel. He said nothing, for words would not cut ropes. His knife slid from its sheath, and with one swift stroke he severed the bonds at her wrists. She gasped as blood returned to her hands, but strength failed her, and she sagged against the snow. He freed the infant next, lifting it into his chest, pressing it against his skin, where heat might chase away the claws of winter. The child's cries softened, quieting against the thunder of his heart. The woman tried to speak, lips pale and cracked, but only fragments came, scattered by wind. He bent close and caught the last. "Don't take me back." The words carried no weight of explanation, yet they burned sharp as brand. Someone had done this to her. Someone meant her and her child to be lost to rails and snow, erased from the world without trace. He slid an arm beneath her knees and lifted her, cradling both woman and child as though they were fragile glass. His size made her seem small, her weight hardly more than a bundle of quilts. Snow stung his back, the wind clawed at his skin, but he turned from the rails without hesitation and set his stride toward the faint shadow of his cabin through the blur of white. The storm fought him with all its fury. Drifts rose to his thighs, winds screamed in his ears, yet his steps never faltered. The woman clung weakly to his chest, her face pressed against the heat of him, her eyes fluttering shut with exhaustion. Once she stirred, whispering broken words he could not catch, but her voice was thin as smoke. The infant whimpered, then stilled again, lulled by his steady rhythm, the rumble in his chest a sound of safety. The cabin came at last into view, its outline hunched low against the storm, smoke barely clinging from its chimney. A place built for solitude, for one man alone, but tonight it would hold more. He forced the door open with his shoulder, the warm breath of firelight spilling out to meet the cold, and stepped inside. The room glowed in amber shadows, the hearth crackling with a flame he had left behind. He carried them to the bed in the corner, laying the woman down with care, placing the child against her breast, where it rooted instinctively for warmth and life. She closed her eyes, trembling, but the lines of terror softened at last, if only for a moment. The rancher stoked the fire high, feeding it with split logs until heat filled every corner of the room. His chest rose and fell like a bellows, steam rising from his skin, drops of melted snow running down the lines of muscle and scar. He sat on the stool beside them, his rifle within reach, and let his gaze linger on the woman's face. She was worn from fear and cold, yet beneath the bruises and pallor lay something unbroken. A quiet strength, fragile but real, like the first flame struck from flint. She stirred once more, eyes half open, meeting his. Her lips parted, but no thanks came. Instead there was only that same plea, silent now, but written in her gaze. "Don't let them find me." The fire snapped. Outside, the storm circled the cabin like wolves, the wind rattling at the shutters, searching for a way in. Inside, the child slept, the woman drifted near unconsciousness, and the rancher sat watch, his jaw set like stone. He did not know who had tied them to the rails, or why cruelty had driven them to such an act. But he knew one thing as sure as the snow fell. This storm had delivered them to his hands, and with them, a danger that would not rest easy. He looked once more at the door, shadowed by frost and wind, and knew it would open again soon. The fire spat and hissed as if offended by the snow melting from his shoulders, but the rancher paid it no mind. He had carried them both through the storm, and now that the cabin walls pressed close and the hearth breathed steady heat, the weight of what he had done began to settle. The woman lay upon his bed, a frail shadow in damp cloth, her newborn curled against her chest, their breaths entwined in fragile rhythm. For a moment he only watched, letting his own chest slow, as if his stillness might anchor the room against the storm still raging outside. She stirred faintly, eyes flickering open. The firelight caught them, dark with exhaustion yet shining with something unyielding. She tried to push herself upright, a stubborn gesture born of fear that he might take her child, but her body betrayed her, trembling like a branch in wind. He reached to steady her, hand broad as a spade, but paused before touching. Her mistrust was raw, carved deep by what she had endured. "You're safe," he said at last, the words low, almost reluctant, as if shaped by gravel. His voice was seldom used, rough from silence, but steady. She stared at him, as though testing whether safety could exist in such a place, in such a man. The baby whimpered, rooting blindly. The rancher turned to the pot near the hearth, poured broth into a tin cup, and offered it to her. She tried to lift it, failed, and his hand closed over hers, guiding the cup to her lips. The warmth returned faint color to her cheeks. When she drank, her lashes lowered, not in trust yet, but in surrender to necessity. He moved about the cabin with the practiced economy of solitude, setting logs on the fire, hanging his wet shirt across a chair, checking the latch on the door. The storm clawed at the roof, but the cabin held. Shadows played on the log walls, rising and falling with the flames. The woman followed his movements, her body still weak but her gaze sharper now, noting each detail of the man who had cut her free. He was scarred, shoulders furrowed by old labor, face lined deeper than his years should warrant. Yet his hands, when they touched the child to check its warmth, were surprisingly careful, as though he feared breaking porcelain. Her voice came thin, but it carried weight. "They meant us to die." The words hung in the air, brittle and cold. She did not name who they were, nor why. Her breath caught after, and her eyes searched his face, waiting. He did not press her. Instead he nodded once, as if he had long ago stopped expecting the world to be merciful. Silence stretched, filled only by the storm outside, and the crackle of sap bursting in the fire. She pulled the baby closer, clutching as though even shadows could steal him. Her fingers shook, yet her arms tightened with fierce resolve. It was then that the rancher noticed the bruises darkening her wrists, the marks of rope cut into her skin, and he felt heat surge through him, hotter than any fire. He looked away quickly, jaw hardening, because anger did nothing for a starving woman and child. The baby began to fuss, mewling softly. The rancher, with a motion almost hesitant, reached out. She resisted at first, clutching tighter, but her exhaustion won. She yielded the bundle slowly, her eyes never leaving his. He cradled the newborn in his arms, the child barely larger than his forearm, its fists waving against the cavern of his chest. He rocked gently, a rhythm remembered from long ago, before loss had closed that part of his life. The babe quieted, nestling against him, soothed by the rough thrum of his heartbeat. The woman watched, her lips parting in silent astonishment. She had expected a brute. What else could one imagine of a man shirtless in the snow, broad as a bear? Yet there he stood, bent close to her child, his voice a soft hum more felt than heard, patience etched into his every movement. Something within her, long beaten down, stirred with cautious warmth. She whispered her name then, as though giving it was the last defense she had left. It cracked in the air, a sound barely above the fire's murmur. He nodded again, repeating it under his breath, anchoring it in his memory. His own name followed after a pause, gruff but steady, and the space between them shifted. Not yet trust, but the first plank of a bridge laid across a dark river. Minutes slipped into hours. She drifted in and out of sleep, the child safe in the crook of her arm when he returned it. Each time her eyes opened, she saw him there, by the fire, by the door, tending to both without question. He spoke little, yet his silence was not emptiness. It was the quiet of a man who held words carefully, offering them only when needed. When at last she slept deeply, her breath even, he allowed himself to lean back, though his gaze never strayed from the door. The storm had not lessened. It howled and clawed as if the world outside wanted to tear its way in. He thought of the men who had done this. They would not believe her gone, not so easily. Cruelty seldom left its work unfinished. The fire dimmed, shadows stretching taller. He fed it more wood, the sparks climbing like stars against the smoke-stained chimney. In that flicker, he studied her sleeping face. Young, far too young to bear such scars of cruelty. Yet beneath the bruises and frostbite lay resilience. Her features softened in rest, revealing not weakness but a strength quiet as roots under snow. His own memories pressed forward, faces of those he had lost, voices silenced by time. He pushed them back, focusing instead on the fragile lives now entrusted to him. He had not asked for them, yet the weight on his chest told him they were his to bear now, for however long fate demanded. The storm raged into midnight, but the cabin stood as a world apart. Firelight flickering, shadows bending, two strangers bound by necessity, and an infant tying them tighter than words ever could. Outside, the plains howled with emptiness. Inside, a seed had been planted, though neither of them yet knew what it would grow into. And as he sat there, rifle leaned within arm's reach, he heard it again, far off, faint, yet clear beneath the roar of wind. Hooves striking frozen earth. A rider moving through the storm. His shoulders stiffened, and his hands slid toward the weapon, slow and silent. The woman stirred in her sleep, as though some part of her sensed it too. Her hand clutched the child tighter, and her lips parted with a whisper even in dream. Don't let them take him. The days following the storm passed in a quiet rhythm that felt suspended outside of time. The cabin, small and rough, became a cocoon where firelight softened the edges of fear. The woman healed slowly, color returning to her cheeks, though shadows still lingered beneath her eyes. The child thrived in the warmth, his cries less frantic now, his tiny fists clutching at her dress as if to remind her that he still belonged to this world. The rancher moved among them like a mountain, silent, steady, carrying out the labors of wood, water, and stock with the same surety he carried her from the tracks. Though she had not spoken much, he noticed the way her gaze followed him, searching. Sometimes when he returned from outside, frost crusted in his beard, she would look at him with something caught between gratitude and unease. She had learned his silence was not indifference, but still it weighed heavy. Words, for her, had been stolen too often. Perhaps she longed to hear them restored. One morning, as light poured cold and pale through the small window, he told her they would ride into town. Supplies had thinned during the storm, and she needed more than broth to mend. At the mention, her face paled, as though the word itself carried chains. Yet she did not protest. A child required food, and hiding forever in shadow was no way to live. The path into town wound through thawing snow, the land glistening like glass in the sun. She sat behind him on the broad-backed horse, her arms clutching the child close, her cheek brushing the wool of his coat. She kept her gaze low, but she could feel the strength in his frame as each step carried them forward. The air smelled of pine and melting frost, yet under it her fear still rose sharp. The settlement came into view, A cluster of buildings huddled against the endless plain. Smoke rose from chimneys, mingling with the breath of livestock. Children played near the well, their laughter thin in the brittle air. But when the rancher rode in, the sound faltered. Heads turned. Eyes fixed. Whispers spread like a draft under doors. He dismounted and helped her down, his hand lingering to steady her though she trembled. With the child in her arms, she stepped onto the packed earth of the street. She felt the weight of every gaze, the sharp edge of judgment, the curiosity of gossip, the disdain of those who measured worth by wealth and reputation. A woman bound to the rails, saved not by kin but by a solitary man, could not escape whispers. Inside the general store, warmth embraced them, but it could not shield her from stares. The shopkeeper, an older man with weary eyes, greeted the rancher with nod and respect, but when his gaze fell on her, pity clouded it. He asked nothing, but the silence between words was heavy with knowing. She stood straight, cradling her child, and bore it as one bears a lash, without flinching. The rancher gathered supplies with his usual brevity, flour, beans, cloth for swaddling, and placed them on the counter. When he reached for coins, the shopkeeper hesitated, his glance flicking toward her again. "Hard winter for everyone," he murmured, not unkind, yet the words carried the weight of judgment. Another mouth to feed, another burden. The rancher's voice rumbled low, final. "They're under my roof." Nothing more was said. Outside, the murmurs followed them. Women standing near the dressmaker's door exchanged whispers behind gloved hands. A man by the saloon spat into the snow, eyes narrowed as they passed. The rancher kept his stride even, his broad frame a wall between her and their scorn, but she felt each look carve into her like a blade. Shame clung to her skin, heavy as the ropes had been. Back at the horse, she paused, her arms tightening around the child. She had lived under cruelty before, but this, the cold dismissal of a town that saw her as ruined, was a different wound. She turned her face into the baby's hair to hide tears, though the rancher noticed. He said nothing, but his hand steadied her as he lifted her into the saddle. That single touch spoke more than comfort. It was a declaration. The ride back was silent but not empty. Her mind replayed the stares, the whispers, the way even kindness had been edged with suspicion. Yet when she glanced at the man before her, his shoulders squared against wind, she felt something she had not known in years. Protection without demand. No bargain, no cruelty, only presence. It unsettled her, for such steadiness was foreign. Days slid into weeks, marked by small rituals that slowly wove them into one another's lives. She began tending to the cabin, mending his shirts, sweeping the floor, preparing meals with what they had. He never asked it of her, but neither did he refuse. At times when she stitched by the fire, she felt his gaze rest on her. Not hungry or pitying, but thoughtful, as though he were memorizing the shape of quiet resilience. At night when the child fussed, he would rise before she did, lifting the boy with hands gentle enough to still his cries. She would watch from her pallet by the fire, heart aching with the sight of this giant man cradling a babe against his chest, as if it were the most natural act in the world. Slowly, distrust gave way to something else. She did not yet name it, but it warmed her even as fear still clung. The town, however, did not forget. Whispers reached the cabin through passing traders and drifting talk. Her kin, those who had bound her to the rails, were restless, unsettled that she lived still. Some said they claimed rights to the child, others that they meant to drag her back. Each rumor stirred unease in her heart. One evening, as dusk bled across the sky and the cabin filled with the scent of stew, she gathered courage. "They won't stop," she whispered, eyes fixed on the spoon in her hand. "They'll come." The words trembled but carried truth. The rancher looked up from the fire, his face shadowed. His silence stretched, but when he spoke, his voice was steady iron. "Let them come." Nothing more, yet the weight in his tone sank into her bones. That night she lay awake, listening to the wind prowl the eaves, clutching her child close. The rancher sat in his chair, rifle across his knees, as though sleep were a luxury he no longer claimed. Firelight painted him in bronze and shadow, a sentinel carved from patience. She wanted to believe his words, yet dread coiled still in her chest. Sometime near midnight, She rose to add wood to the fire. As the logs caught, she glanced toward the window. In the flicker of flame against glass, she thought she saw movement, a shape beyond the tree line, watching, waiting. Her breath caught, and for a moment she was back on the rails, bound and helpless. She turned quickly to the rancher. His eyes were already on the door, as though he too had sensed what the night carried closer. Snow fell again, heavier than before, a curtain drawn across the land that muffled all sound except the whisper of the storm itself. The woman sat near the fire, the child warm against her chest, but her gaze lingered on the window, as though eyes alone could keep shadows at bay. The rancher had sensed it too, the unease that had grown since that ride into town, the whispers of kin who had lost their hold on her, and now stirred with vengeance. Tonight the air felt too alive, the silence outside too sharp, as if the world held its breath before breaking. He rose from his chair and pulled the rifle close, checking its chamber with the same quiet certainty with which he split wood or mended fence. The woman watched, her heart tightening. She wanted to ask if he thought they would come, but the answer was written already in his shoulders, in the way he kept glancing toward the door. Fear stirred, but alongside it ran something new, trust. If they came, she would not be alone. The storm deepened until the cabin seemed an island adrift in endless white. Hours passed. The child slept. Then it came. The crunch of hooves breaking crusted snow, faint but steady, circling the cabin like wolves testing prey. The rancher's jaw tightened. He moved to the door, standing in silence, listening. She held her breath until her chest burned, her arms curling protectively around the baby. The first knock was not with knuckles but the flat of a boot against the door, hard, demanding. A voice followed, harsh and mocking, calling her name as though it were a curse. "You think you can hide? You think you can shame us and live?" Laughter spilled after, rough and cruel. More than one voice. 3, maybe 4. Men who had chosen winter's cruelty, to finish what the rails had not. The rancher opened the door himself. The storm surged in, snow biting at the flames until shadows danced wild across the walls. He stepped out shirtless, his body steaming in the bitter air, a giant against the night. Behind him, the woman gasped, for the sight was like something out of old tales, an iron figure standing between home and harm. The men shifted at the sight, but pride stiffened them. One spat into the snow. "That woman belongs to us. The child too. Step aside." The rancher's voice came low, steady, carrying over the wind. "No one belongs to cruelty." For a heartbeat silence fell, the storm the only witness. Then the first man lunged, swinging a club. The rancher moved with the patience of stone, and the strength of thunder. The blow glanced off his arm, but his fist answered, sending the attacker sprawling into the drift. Another raised a pistol, but the rancher's rifle was already up, aimed steady at his chest. The man faltered, curses freezing in his throat. The woman watched from the doorway, her heart pounding, the child stirring against her. Terror clawed at her ribs, yet awe pressed close beside it. This was no hollow defense. This was a stand carved from conviction, from a vow he had spoken without words since the moment he cut her free. The fight turned brutal. Snow churned beneath boots and blood stained white drifts. The rancher moved like a force of nature, deliberate, unshaken, every strike protective rather than vengeful. One man fled into the storm, another lay groaning in the snow. The last, the cruelest, stood panting, eyes burning with hatred. He looked past the rancher to the woman, his sneer curling like smoke. "You'll never be free. You're nothing but shame." Her breath caught. The words struck deep, echoing every judgment she had endured. Yet before despair could swallow her, the rancher's voice cut through, sharp and final. "She is not nothing. She is more than any of you will ever be." With those words, he drove the man back, the storm swallowing him as surely as the rails would have. Silence fell again, broken only by the hiss of snow settling on the earth. The rancher stood heaving, steam rising from his skin, blood on his knuckles. Slowly he turned back toward the cabin. The woman remained at the door, tears burning hot against her cold skin. The child whimpered softly, sensing the weight in the air. She met the rancher's gaze, and for the first time since the night of the rescue, Her fear eased beneath something greater: belief. He stepped inside, shutting the door against the storm, his breath loud in the sudden quiet. He set the rifle aside, though his eyes lingered on it, knowing the night had not ended all threats. She reached for him without thinking, her hand trembling as it touched his chest, feeling the heat of him, the steadiness beneath the scars. Her voice broke in a whisper. "Why do you do this for me?" His eyes softened, gray as storm clouds lit by dawn. "Because no one should be left on the rails." The fire crackled, casting them in shifting light, and in that moment something unspoken passed between them, binding them tighter than rope ever could. The child stirred, crying softly, and the rancher reached to lift him, his huge hands careful, his movements steady. She watched, her heart swelling with an ache she had not known she still carried. The ache of being seen, of being sheltered without cost. Outside, the storm raged on, covering tracks, burying all sign of the fight. Inside, warmth and shadow held them close, but they knew peace was fragile. Cruelty did not vanish in one night. It would return, perhaps with greater force, demanding what it thought it owned. The rancher sat by the fire with the child in his arms, the woman beside him, silence stretching wide but full. She leaned near, exhaustion pulling at her, but within her chest burned something stronger than fear. For the first time she believed tomorrow might hold more than survival. Then came the sound, a lone horse galloping through the storm, hooves striking hard against frozen ground. Not the shuffle of retreat, but the deliberate rhythm of someone returning. The rancher's head lifted, his eyes narrowing, the muscles in his jaw set like stone. The woman clutched her child tighter, the memory of ropes burning against her wrists. She knew before he spoke that the reckoning was not over. The storm relented at last, though its memory lay heavy across the land. Snow lay deep and untouched, smoothing over the scars of struggle, as if the world itself wished to forget. In the cabin, the woman sat with her child in her lap, her face lit by the weak glow of dawn through frost-streaked panes. She had not slept much, though her eyes held a brightness new to them, a kind of fragile peace born of survival. The rancher moved quietly about the room, stoking the fire, setting logs aside, his broad frame steady even in silence. The fight of the night before had marked him with bruises and a cut across his brow, yet he carried himself as though the weight of it mattered little. His glance lingered on her often, though he spoke few words. The child gurgled softly, reaching for his mother's hair. She smiled faintly, a rare expression that softened the hollows of her face. For weeks she had lived between fear and exhaustion, but now as the storm cleared, something else stirred within her. The sense that life, not merely survival, might be possible again. She looked at the rancher and felt it stronger still. He had stood when others had fled. He had spoken for her when others had silenced. In him was no demand, no bargain, only a strength that had carried her from death into the fragile dawn of another day. He stepped toward her then, pausing only a moment before crouching at her side. The firelight played across the planes of his face, etching lines of weariness and resolve. He reached for the child, lifting him gently, the infant fitting into the curve of his arm with surprising ease. The woman watched, her heart aching with a mixture of wonder and fear. She whispered, "He will not remember the rails. Only what comes after." The rancher looked at her, and in his eyes was something she had not dared hope for, belief in her words. "Then let what comes after be different," he said quietly. It was not a promise spoken loudly, but it fell into the room like a stone into water, sending ripples through her chest. As the days passed, the town's whispers did not fade. If anything, they grew, for news of the failed attack had spread. Some spoke of the rancher as a fool, tethering himself to a woman whose past they called shame. Others saw him as a threat for standing against men of standing blood. But in their cabin, the talk did not reach so far. The woman found herself working with him, mending harness, tending stew, rocking the child when his arms grew weary. Their lives wove together not by declaration but by necessity, and in that necessity grew understanding. Each gesture, a shared glance, a steady hand offered across the table, the way his silence sheltered rather than excluded, laid stones on a path neither of them had expected to walk. One morning, beneath a sky washed clean by the storm, he returned from checking stock with frost clinging to his beard. He set his gloves aside and stood before her, hands roughened from labor, yet trembling slightly as he reached for hers. "A child should bear a name," he said. "And a woman should not bear it alone." The words came haltingly, not rehearsed, but the weight in them was heavier than vows spoken with grandeur. She stared at him, her breath caught, the child stirring softly between them. For a long moment she could not speak, her throat thick with tears unshed. Then she nodded, her hand closing around his, and whispered, "I thought I had no right to such a thing again." The wedding was no grand affair. There were no silks, no church bells, no crowded pews. Instead there was a field blanketed in snow, a handful of kind souls who stood not for spectacle but for witness, the old shopkeeper who had looked on her with pity, the widow who had offered quiet kindness, and 2 ranch hands who had worked beside him in seasons past. The sky held the pale light of morning, the sun struggling against clouds but breaking through in soft beams that gilded the snow. She wore a simple shawl he had bought her, the fabric plain but wrapped around her shoulders with care. He stood tall beside her, shirtless despite the cold, scars and muscle bared to wind, as if to show the world he had nothing to hide. When the vows came, they were not recited from memory, but spoken from the marrow of their bones. He promised not to shield her from storms, but to stand with her through them. She promised not perfection but truth, her heart given as it was, battered yet unbroken. When the child cried out mid-vow, the rancher did not falter. He lifted the babe high, cradling him with pride, and said with voice steady as iron, "This is my son now, as much as my own breath is mine." The witnesses murmured, moved not by grandeur but by the stark simplicity of it. The woman wept openly, tears hot against the cold air, for in those words her deepest fear, that her child would forever be a mark of shame, was silenced. The ceremony ended without flourish, only the quiet stamping of boots on snow, the wind rushing across plains, the fire of 2 souls standing unbroken. They turned toward the cabin together, husband, wife, and child, their steps steady though the world might yet judge them. What had begun in cruelty and shadow, now bent toward light. That night, with the fire burning low and the storm finally gone, they sat together in the cabin. She leaned against him, her child safe in his arms, and for the first time in years she felt not hunted but held. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was alive, filled with promise. She looked at him and whispered, "We were tied to rails, but you gave us a road instead." He pressed his forehead gently to hers, and neither spoke further, for the truth needed no more words. Outside, snow melted beneath a sky bright with stars. Inside, warmth and belonging grew, fragile yet fierce, a new beginning rooted in quiet defiance. And though they did not know what trials might yet come, one thing was certain. They would face them not as strangers bound by chance, but as a family forged in fire and storm.